Hello and welcome to a special discussion on The Wire today. India's export and trade story has been in the news this week after the Narendra Modi government decided to exit the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, a massive Asian free trade pact that would have covered 16 countries and included 50% of the world's population into one trade bloc. The decision to exit the RCEP comes after years of negotiation failed to produce a final text that the Indian government could get on board with. The decision has sparked both praise and criticism, praise from a wide array of domestic stakeholders across the political spectrum in India, who have argued that the move would have allowed local goods from across the world, cheap goods, to come into the economy and destroy the business interests of local producers. Critics, however, say that the decision is also an admission of failure, an admission that successive governments have failed to produce industries and businesses that are competitive in a global economy. To discuss this and more, we have with us today Dr. Surjit Bhalla. Dr. Bhalla is the former part-time member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister and was recently appointed as the Executive Director for India on the board of the IMF. Of particular relevance to today's discussion is a recent report released by a high-level advisory group on trade and policy. The report, which is around 250 pages, examines to a certain extent how we got here, and more importantly gives a list of recommendations and solutions on how to increase India's share in global trade. Dr. Bhalla, thanks for being here today with us. To start with, India's export story over the last 7 years has not been pretty. As your own report notes, from 2012 to 2017, India's merchandise exports actually declined on an average rate of 4.5% per annum. This fiscal as well, September 2019, that is 2 months ago, data shows that exports have contracted for the third month in a row in this fiscal year, and decline is being seen across segments: processed crude oil, gems and jewelry, engineering goods. But your report sticks to its guns and says that India's export target can be doubled by 2025. That is, as of last year, we were hovering around the 500 billion mark, and we will hit 1 trillion in 6 years. Given our lackluster performance so far and the fact that global growth recovery is still expected to be tepid, is this target perhaps too optimistic? And what about our current scenario gives you hope, or does it hinge on this government coming out with drastic reform in the next 2 to 3 years?
You know, you've got several very good questions all in that, and I will try and answer. First, just a factual question. India's exports, and this is in the report, from 2011-12 to 2018-19 or 17-18 is our time period when we end, have stayed broadly the same, not declined by 4% per annum, have stayed almost the same and gone up by 2 or 3 percentage points in the aggregate.
Sure.
Some years shot up by 9, etc. One of the most interesting, I think, features brought out in the report is that world trade fell off a cliff. World exports fell off a cliff starting 2011-12. It had world trade in dollar terms had been growing at something like 12, 14, 15% per annum, and world trade since 2011-12 has actually declined by 2 or 3 percentage points in the aggregate, which means that India's share world trade has marginally gone up. So that's the first point. And we note that across every sector, India's trade performance has worsened relative to other countries. And we look at what the causes of that decline would be. I will come to the optimism part later, but let me come to it in the following, the following observation, that you had also said the world growth is expected to be tepid. And you're absolutely right. The conventional wisdom is certainly that world GDP growth and export growth is expected to be tepid, and there's even talk about a recession in the major economies of the world. I do not subscribe to that view. Right. And there are interesting reasons, I think, why I think that view is invalid, but we do not know. Sure. What we do know is that, look, world trade, even if world was booming, the world trade is not expected to go up like it did in the boom period of 2002 to 2011. And I think a conservative or liberal estimate of what world trade will do over the next 5 to 10 years is to grow at maybe 2 or 3% per annum. And you're absolutely right. What we say is that we acknowledge the fact that world trade will grow only at 2-3%, and we say that we can expect, if we can expect Indian export growth to be close to 10% annum. And that's the discrepancy perhaps that you're rightly asking for. We believe the report, when I say we, I mean the report, and there were 12 members of the report. We worked on it a year. Now, what we believe is that the set of policies that have led, and this is very important, if I now look at the period 2012 to 2017, when our export growth was just the same as the world average, we find that there are several countries whose export growth has done phenomenally well. And the most cited ones, but by no means the exclusive ones, are Bangladesh and Vietnam.
Sure.
What has Bangladesh and Vietnam done that we haven't? That's the set of policies comes out, and it really, in a nutshell, is that it's not that Bangladesh and Vietnam joined RCEP. They're not members of RCEP yet, I think. I know Bangladesh is not. It's not that they joined trade agreements. It's that they got their domestic house in order. And that is the major thrust.
So, Dr. Bhalla, you would agree that our domestic house, therefore, is not in order, and for us to double our exports, reforms need to be undertaken over the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
And what if I had to give you a list, top 3?
We come out with several policy recommendations, and both macro as well as micro. Now, in the micro, I will speak more. There were other members of the report who are really experts on the micro side, industry side, what I call. And but the one micro recommendation that I think is very, very important, and I would put it way up on the hierarchy of reforms that we need to do, is setting up an apex investment body.
Sure.
And which a lot of these very successful countries have. And you know, the very successful export-oriented economies have provide great encouragement for foreign investor firms to come in. And there is, you know, in India, if you want to come in, foreign firm has to go through, get 10 different approvals from 10 different departments. Yeah. And what we are suggesting is we really don't need this ancient practice. We need to move with the times, and we should have an apex investment body.
Sure, so a single window body.
Single window body, and which, you know, many, most people have, you know, really approved of it, or I don't think there'll be anybody who will disapprove of it.
That's true.
So that needs to be done. Remember, again, I want to point to, these are all necessary conditions. Yeah. And there are not that many necessary conditions, and they're easily doable. So this is the first one. Now let me come to the set of macro recommendations, and they pertain to different, not necessarily just the finance ministry. Some of them have to do with the finance ministries, some of them have to do with commerce ministries, some of them have to do with other industries, agriculture ministry, some of them has to do with SEBI and so on and so forth. So let me delineate what ails the Indian economy. First and foremost, and I won't even say first and foremost, we Indian individuals and firms pay the highest corporate tax rate in the world. Sure. At least they did until September 20th. Okay, and this is not the report saying, this is OECD. Indian firms and corporates or whatever, our labor laws are the most stringent in the world, with the consequent effect that firm size in India, we can debate whether this law is good or that law is good. As economists, we know, look at the effects. Our firm size is the smallest in the world. This is when the whole world has moved to large firm sizes in order to exploit the advantage of globalization, etc. We have continued to be inward. Now, it doesn't take that much. It's a regulatory structure. Therefore, actually, I should have started with our regulatory strangulation structure is what needs the first reform, and that we call comes under the term mindset. The mindset in India is that we are against profits. Profit is a four-letter word. Broadly, that's the mindset. And what we are saying is, hello, let's move on from this very restrictive mindset. So we need to change our mindset, and within it, these policies. So I mentioned that our firm sizes are very small. Our second or third, that let us look at agriculture is a very important sector of our economy. And simultaneously with agriculture, I want to look at agriculture is the most traditional occupation, sure. Been there for 5,000 years. Financial services is a modern occupation, professional. One requires relatively unskilled labor, one requires highly specialized labor. Now, I want to provide you and the viewers with one striking statistic that the report unearths. It is that in 2018, which is the last year we have data on, as the data comes trickled in, Indian financial exports were just a few $1 billion. Our total exports were 500, which we hope to get to $1 trillion. Financial experts, only a few. And you guys are there, Wire is there, everybody is there. We consider ourselves a leader in modern technology and in artificial intelligence, etc. We would want to be. Yeah. And here we have the biggest area in which we have a comparative advantage. Yeah. As you know, Indians, when they go abroad, do very well. Now, coming back, in 1980, when India was a very poor country, none of the reforms had been introduced, right? And we were heavily dependent on agricultural imports, sure. Food imports, basic. Our agricultural exports in 1980 were greater than our financial exports in 2018. So we are making a plea. Let us understand why this case, and then we just don't identify problems, yeah. We provide solutions. Yeah. So for agriculture, let me come to the simple solution, and this was also advocated in the Shanta Kumar committee, etc. But it's important to understand for agriculture that throughout, we had the 1991 reforms, we had the Bajpayee reforms, we had this reform and that reform. Agriculture has not only not been reformed, but under UPA 1 and 2, it was de-reformed. Okay. We moved backwards by perpetuating the lack of, we just strangulated the agriculture sector a bit more. Right. And strangulated means we allowed more corruption to flourish through the PDS system, and the fact that the government and the mandi system, where a farmer has to go through a mandi to sell his or her produce. There is no country in the world that any legislation even close to that. Why do we have this? So that is what the report says. Free up agriculture completely. No export bans, no import controls, nothing. Now, the Wire will be the first one to say, oh my God, some farmer will lose out and may go ahead and commit suicide, etc. We can't afford that. We agree. So therefore, we are saying, and through the introduction of the PM Kisan system or policy, we are very optimistic that an extension of that. So you lose out and you get compensated through the DBT.
The direct
so that is the agriculture side. Now let me come to finance. In finance, the world has changed. And when I say the mindset, it really is to acknowledge that the world has genuinely changed. One of the aspects of this change is that tax avoidance is something that the entire world set of governments are really, really concerned about. And as you know, that is one of the biggest problems in India. Okay? We now have agreements between countries through PAN numbers. Every country has a tax identification number and they are all shared. And everything is electronic. You go buy and share from a rediwala, that doesn't affect anything, but that's not going to help you in your exports or in your financial exports. So everybody has got a PAN number and all banks are required to do KYC, and KYC etc. is done through the little instrument you're holding in your hand. Very easy to do. Therefore, what is the requirement for an FII? SEBI has that the only way a foreigner can put money into this country is through an FII. We are saying we don't need FIIs, you can be on the moon. As long as you have a PAN number and as long as you have this.
Correct.
Then, one last bit on this and then we can go on, is that we advocate a liberalized, analogous to a liberalized remittance scheme. Viewers might be interested in knowing that he and she and them and they can send abroad per person $250,000 a year, correct? Yes. And this has been in operation. But we do not allow any foreign individual to put money into India. So we are saying that, listen, open up, we are allowed to send $250,000 abroad. The rich American, etc., and there are many more rich Americans and Britishers and Germans and Japanese and Australians than Indians who can send abroad $250,000 a year. So open that up completely. Why not? And we keep asking, if you have a policy which is all existing, not reformed, de-reformed, financial sector has also been de-reformed over the years. And you please come up with an explanation as to how that is needed in this present environment. The plea of the H-Live report is, please recognize India has changed, the world has changed, but our policies haven't.
Have not, yes. And we'll come back to the reforms in a second, but I wanted to bring in the RCEP here now. So in this doubling our export target calculation, where does the RCEP figure? So will it harm us? Will it help us? Will it be, some people say that this is the final wake-up call, that we need to usher all of these reforms that the H-Live report has put forth. But what is your view on this matter?
That's a very important question, and that's an interesting controversy and debate going on, and a very healthy one. There are some who believe that if we had joined RCEP, and mind you, the report is very consistent, we must join RCEP.
Correct.
But, and there's a very important but on our own terms, that is, on terms that are good for our economy and our national interests. But let me come to directly answer that question on the RCEP. So let us say, and I pose you the following counterfactual, let us say, and we do believe RCEP and trade agreements with the US and so on and so forth are all very important agenda items, and we must join them on our own terms. I keep wanting to emphasize. Now let us assume we did all of that. We were able to successfully join RCEP on our own terms and join other trade agreements on our own terms, and we did none of this, of the macro domestic policies that we have that are hindering our development. I don't think joining the RCEP and all, it'll help. But as I have my own estimate, I don't want to, this one is particularly my own estimate, but I think it's consistent with the report and consistent with the sentiment of other writers of the report, that, you know, all of this foreign stuff is about 10%. and our policies are 90%. Now coming back to one of your original points, what do you think? You think we can grow at 10%? I do believe, the report does believe, one, the prospects of reforms, macroeconomic reforms in India have really increased, especially since September 20th, when we cut down corporate tax rates to globally competitive levels. And there may be suggestions that this may be addressed further when the direct tax code is adopted in February. So I think it is keeping that optimism in mind, based on factual evidence, that we think the 10% target can be achieved.
Right. So joining RCEP, so not joining RCEP right now, it won't hurt us in the near or short term.
I think, I don't think so. Right. It'll help, but I think if you, the stronger point is, it's neither necessary nor sufficient for us to achieve the targets of the economy and the targets as set out in the HLAG report.
The HLAG report also comes with an interesting, so I mean, you commissioned a study or a research paper from the National Council of Applied Economic Research, and it runs through various simulations, and one of the simulations is if India joined an RCEP like free trade arena. And it says, and I'm quoting here, that India's exports would be the most out of all ASEAN nations. They would increase by 11.5%. Investment would increase, GDP would increase, consumption would increase. But all this is only if we are able to agree to our own terms. Is that the disclaimer on that?
And secondly, it is a ceteris paribus argument. They are assuming none of our macro policies change. This happens and we need to worry, and again it's a counterfactual, very good estimate, etc. So clearly, but you know, that's 11% in the aggregate, comparative statics, over 5 years, etc. That's 2% a year, and what we believe, we need to grow 10% a year on an average basis. And so I think the NCR report and what the report itself says are very consistent with each other.
Right. The report, I mean the HLAG report and your personal views are also perhaps that in domestic thinking maligns free trade agreements too much currently. That many people say that we have not benefited from those that we've signed, we've run up deficits, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, we have now been negotiating the RCEP for 7 years, from 2012 to 2013. So 2 years under the previous government, 4 or 5 years under the current one. Is there a sense that we have not been able to use our clout to get what we want, or have, as some others have suggested, that RCEP in particular was sort of, the deck was rigged in China's favor, and we would never be able to, some of the demands, or whether base year tariffs or the country of origin, these are things that we would, it's not possible in this sort of forum.
Look, none of us know what were the exact terms of the negotiations and where did it falter. We have some clues that we wanted base year to be the most recent one rather than ancient base year of 2014-15, and there is some allusion to perhaps China being perhaps too closed or whatever. What we do know in the world is that one of the major elements that has changed in the world macroeconomy and trade, is the US-China trade war. And the US-China trade war is the US's belief, and which goes against what it had believed earlier, US government and US business, that open trade with China was very, very good, and many of the firms benefited. And now the firms themselves have come around to the view that maybe it was not so favorable to the US. So I think, you know, that's a reality, and we need to, so when the report says we should negotiate from strength and we should try and get the best terms possible, it is basically looking at the global environment. One of the things the report also says, that because of this US-China trade war, we have a genuine opportunity
to exploit it.
And you know, in 2010-11, we had the similar chance when China moved up the value added scale. And then we thought we can really exploit it. And what happened? You know, Cambodia had our breakfast, Vietnam had our lunch, and Bangladesh had our dinner. And we should be, and I think we are very cognizant of the fact that we cannot let this opportunity go. Right. Again, I come back, it has to do with our mindset. Yeah. It has to do, remember, the world gave you this opportunity, yeah, and we didn't exploit it. So this is confirmation of the fact, you know, the fault, dear Brutus, yeah, is not in the foreigners, but in ourselves.
And in the same vein, do you feel that we sometimes blame, amongst policymakers and domestic thinkers, that we blame the global slowdown a little too much? Because in the beginning of the report, you have a very interesting table which examines two time periods, one from 2003 to 2011, when global export growth was quite healthy, and then the downturn from 2012 to 2017. And India's rank actually dips, so it goes from 10, 11 to 33, which would imply that while certainly our export growth is correlated to global growth, it's still
absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm very glad you brought that. One of the other, and this has to do perhaps with a mindset, or let you and viewers decide, one of the factors that has been offered by our economists and by our experts for this decline in trade growth, which you rightly noticed, or that we emphasize, is that our real exchange rate has appreciated. And what the report is at pains to point out, how do we get the conclusion that our real exchange rate has appreciated? We get it by looking at the RBI's 36 country index of competitiveness, which is the real exchange rate. And according to that, it has gone up by 15% or whatever, and that, they say, is responsible for this downfall. What we show, there is a, remember, if Vietnam's exchange rate appreciates by 12% and India's exchange rate appreciates by 12%, nothing happens to our competitiveness. Yeah. What many of the Indian experts fail to recognize, that the RBI figure that they are using is only for individual countries. It's completely false economics. You have to look at how your real exchange rate has done compared to your competitors. And if we do that, according to now there are more indices available by the Bureau of International Settlements, that Bank of International Settlements, BIS, that India's exchange rate in that very same table we showed was something like 97.9 in 2002 to 2011 when our exports boomed, and 97.9 when our exports collapsed relative to other countries. So, you know, I think that's another policy conclusion, that
we need to stop using it as a crutch, or as a defense.
We need to stop using it as a crutch, as an excuse. And, you know, the belief that if we change the exchange rate, we'll reach nirvana, has two elements to it. You know, as it happens, I did a book called Devaluing to Prosperity, which was published in 2012. So and had data until 2009-10, and which is for the world, world economies from 1950 to now, and world export growth. And what it found out is that the conclusion of the report is that China had really exploited the world trading, economic, exchange rate system by heavily undervaluing its currency. I wrote that. So obviously I believe that exchange rate plays an important part. However, what most of the people who now advocate the exchange rate devaluation story have failed to read chapter 12, in which I stated that, look, what China was able to do, the world will not allow you, any major country, to do that again. If Singapore depreciates by 20%, it makes no difference. But the world is not going to allow. That was written in 2012. The US-China trade war supports my 2012 conclusion.
Right. Okay. Understood. Another aspect that the HLAG report brings out is an issue that is near and dear to your heart: the cost of capital in India, and specifically policy rates. And many people would say that the RBI under Shaktikanta Das has made good strides, and the MPC under him has made some good headway. And we've seen things like out-of-the-box rate cuts, like 35 basis points. But you still believe this is not enough?
Okay, let's look at that. I do think that the RBI MPC under Shaktikant Das has made considerable progress from my vantage point, and you're right, I've been arguing this for 2 decades and nobody has been listening except now Shaktikant Das perhaps is listening. However, what has happened in the time period he has cut rates? So if I look at inflation April to this fiscal year, April to September, and I look at inflation April to September last year. April to September inflation this year has gone up at has declined by 120 basis points, and the RBI MPC has cut rates by 135 basis points, which means you dug a mountain, and so basically real rates, if anything, I think, and if you look at the lending rates, not the RBI, they've actually gone up in real terms. Correct. So so please tell me how our cost of capital has declined even with the best of intentions from the RBI. Cost of capital has gone up. And let's look at this is one of the major recommendations of the report, is that we need to move our cost of capital to the top 10, 15 OECD countries, which I'm sure the Wire won't disagree with. Nobody should, I think, disagree with that, in order to be competitive. What that means is, if you look at the cost of capital measured as the real policy rate, there's no other way to measure it. You can't measure it in nominal terms, which some people seem to think. If you measure it in real terms, the real policy rate in OECD economies, the median is something like minus 0.5%. So what we are advocating, if we move to that we are advocating that our real policy rate is something like 2.5. That we need a 300 basis point cut in the policy rate tomorrow. Right. Now you can do it over 3 months or 6 months, but we're not talking 25 basis points or 35 basis points.
Right. Some would also argue that, I mean, this is less relevant if you don't address other factors like transmission, or the fact that interest rates on small savings schemes have not. And then the HLAG report goes on to suggest that the government should cut interest rates on small savings schemes, which would be politically controversial. I mean,
well, no, absolutely. So I'm glad you say that look, our report, by the nature of the report, addresses various departments in the government. And the RBI is a specialist, not a department of the government, it's an independent central bank. But we nevertheless say, absolutely right, and indeed I was heartened, and the report even says that the rate on small savings, etc., should be lower than the market rate, not equal to. And I was very heartened by the news this morning that I read in the papers that the finance minister herself had stated that we need to cut policy rates. So 2 points. First, we need to cut our small savings, etc., rates to aid the transmission. Second, just like we discussed on RCEP, etc., if you think that is going, let's say we were to cut, so therefore our policy rate gets down by about 25, 30 basis points, again, no difference. We need to cut big, the repo rate, by something like 250 to 300 basis points, and we need to do, the government, that is the central government, has to put its house in order. Right. Remember, the whole key is we need to put our house in order. Yeah. Each government department needs to put its house in order, and they need to cut this. Right. So, you know, and one of the things of the report, of the basic recommendations, we don't believe you can pick and choose. Right. And that's why we are confident that the government won't pick and choose, that it will be a combination of these policies, and therefore we'll be able, for the first time in history, to grow at our potential rates.
Yeah. Before we end this discussion, Dr. Bhalla, a more political question sort of to end the thing. So this government has a mandate that is extremely strong. It is a mandate for courageous decisions, one to be pushed forth. What is stopping it from some of these reforms? So even, for instance, out of the 5-6 major issues that you list out, corporate tax cuts is one of them. That also does not seem to us, you know, in the media or in the public sphere, as part of a reform roadmap, but instead it was a response to the crisis. You know, the stock markets were not reacting well to the budget, and hence the corporate tax rate cut had to come in.
Well, okay. First, just the logical, factual point that many of us, including the Y, etc., were also critical of the budget. Yeah. And, you know, so the stock market also at that time was hurt. Yet they brought out a budget which, you know, politically, since you ask, I think it is absolutely remarkable. And I do not know of any other parallel incident, either in India or anywhere else, where political courage has been shown of the same magnitude as this government. It takes a lot of political courage to reverse yourself, and this government has done that. So we can let us table, they had a budget that was disappointed many, and they have started to reverse course. So the larger question, and I do think the political mandate is very important. They have a large, actually for a re-election, the largest mandate in history. So, you know, and the largest gain, etc. Absolutely in complete agreement, they have a very strong political mandate. And I don't want to say they should do this, but they can do this politically. Those obstacles are not there. So I would just say the corporate tax cut happened in September 20th. Okay. If this is the only reform, macro reform that they bring about, I'll be the first to say I'm very disappointed. I think the jury is out, should be out, till at least 3 to 6 months from now, and perhaps at a maximum a year from now. And I think that's where we really should reach both an evaluation and a judgment as to whether the Modi government has used the political advantage that it has, that it earned, to bring about major, mega macroeconomic reforms in India.
Yeah, all right, great. On that note, I think we'll end this discussion. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.